Welcome to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. School of Excellence.
We remember MLK honored this special day. He had a dream that we would stand united together in this land, that we would strive to find a way to live as friends in peace today.
He wanted each of us to see the beauty of equality. He taught that right overcomes wrong, that hope can turn the weak to strong, and showing love instead of hate would make our country truly great.
This message meant to set us free was filled with hope for you and me. So on this day, let freedom ring as we remember Dr. King.
I'm gonna call you Michael.
I'll call you Martin.
Martin.
Martin. Martin goes to college.
Hey. Good. You're right.
I'm missing that.
Dun, 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 walk. Dun, 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 walk. Dun, 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 dun.
Dr. Luther King Jr. and request Scott, Mary, and Bison in 1953.
In the 1954, Martin Luther King goes there. He goes to the church.
In 1954,
In 1954,
King passed his test
King passed his test
and became Dr. King.
to become Dr. King.
In 1955,
In 1955,
Yolanda King
Yolanda King
was born.
was born.
She became an activist.
She became an activist.
Good evening, everyone. I'm so glad that you all came out today to rally together to protest the segregation of buses. I'm going to do a roll call. Abe, Mary, Ruth, John, Irene, Sadie, Rosa, Esther, Betty, Tom, Matthew. As you all know, this is a dangerous journey, but we are standing up against an injustice called segregation. With that said, we are boycotting all buses. If you need a ride, there are members of our group that will pick you up and take you to where you need to go. Are we all in agreement? We need one person that will refuse to give up their seat on the bus. Anyone? Rosa Parks.
Local and national Black company leaders needed a rallying moment to spark the Montgomery bus boycott. Rosa Parks bravely volunteered to refuse to give up her seat to a white man at the great personal risk of to herself to protest the segregation of buses.
On January 30th, 1956, Martin Luther King Jr. House was bombed by segregationists in retaliation of success of the Montgomery bus boycott.
On June 5th, 1956, the Federal District Court ruled in Browder v. Gale that bus segregation was unconstitutional. In November 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court affirmed Browder v. Gale and struck down laws requiring segregated seating on public buses.
1957, he was featured on the cover of Time magazine for his role on Montgomery bus boycott.
At midnight on March 6, King attended the official ceremony in which the British Union Jack was lowered and the new flag of Ghana was raised, and the British colony of the Gold Coast became the independent nation of Ghana. Martin Luther King III was born October 23, 1957. He is an American human rights activist and advocate.
King Abernathy, E.D. Nixon, and Glenn Smiley are among the first passengers to sit themselves in the section formerly reserved for whites.
President Eisenhower discusses race discrimination with King and other black civil rights leaders. Following the meeting, the group answers questions from the press. His first book, called Stride Towards Freedom, describes the condition of African Americans living in Alabama during the era and chronicles the event of the boycott and its aftermath.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was just 29 when he was stabbed in the chest during a 1958 book signing in Harlem.
Under the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr., the organization drew on the power and independence of black churches to support its activities.
Martin Luther King Jr. visited India in 1959 to honor Gandhi and nonviolence.
On February 17, 1960, a warrant was issued for the arrest of civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on charges of tax evasion. He was accused of allegedly falsifying his Alabama income tax returns for the years 1956 and 1958. He was the only person over prosecuted under the state's income tax perjury statute. There was no evidence of fraud that said the not guilty verdict from the all-white jury after 3 hours and 43 minutes of deliberation.
On October 19, 1960, 52 individuals, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., were arrested in downtown Atlanta, Georgia, after refusing to leave their seats at segregation department store lunch counters.
Dexter Scott King was born January 30, 1961. He is an American civil rights activist and the second son of civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr.
As the violence and Federation intervention propelled the Freedom Riders to national prominence, King became one of the major spokesmen for the rights.
Friday morning, September 28, 1962, in Birmingham, Alabama, a man named James approached Martin. James was well entrenched in the American Nazi Party.
He was looking to make a statement and made it toward King. James was upset because a black man wanted to marry a white woman. King stood his ground and spoke this mind in a positive manner. James did not like this and punched him twice in the face.
The crowd was about to attack this man, but surprisingly, a black woman was around him, roundly her arms around James.
She shouted towards the crowd, "Don't hurt him. Can't you see he is disturbed? We have to love him."
On August 28, 1963, 250,000 people rallied in Washington, D.C. to demand an end to segregation, fair wages and economic justice, voting rights, education, and a long overdue civil rights protection.
Civil rights leaders took to the podium to
issue urgent calls to action that still resonate decades later.
As thousands gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial with anticipation, a young Southern reverend named Martin Luther King Jr. stood behind the podium. "We must meet hate with love," he implored his audience in a lofty baritone. A couple of yeahs could be heard.
Martin Luther King Jr. and other leaders spoke at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation.
May students know that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his historic speech on August 28, 1963 at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, but they may not realize that the leaders of the march arranged to meet with President Kennedy in the White House on the day of the march. A few days later, Kennedy met with King and other leaders regarding federal intervention in the civil rights struggle. Kennedy's civil rights legislation remained stalled in Congress when he was assassinated on the 22nd of November 1963.
In the White House, 1963, President Lyndon B. Johnson meets with Martin Luther King Jr. Johnson cites the Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawing discrimination based on race or color, sex, religion, or national origin. This act also prohibits discrimination in vote registration as well as segregation in schools, employment, and public accommodations.
In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested and sent to jail because he and others were protesting the treatment of blacks in Alabama. A court had ordered that King could not hold protests.
Dozens more civil rights merchants arrested in Birmingham. On April 12, 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and at least 55 others, almost all of whom were black, were jailed for parading without a permit during a march against segregation in Birmingham, Alabama.
Bernice Albertine King was born March 20, 1963. She is an American lawyer, minister, and the youngest child of civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr.
King wrote his letter from Birmingham jail in response to a public statement by a white clergyman appealing to the local black population to use the court of not the street to secure civil rights.
Facts about the book: it's a collection of sermons loved by Martin Luther King that overcome hate. He wanted people not to just read the book, but to get Martin Luther King's message by hearing the words.
Strength to
Strength.
stand
Stand up tall.
to lose
Love
loves
was Martin Luther King.
Second book
Published. 3 of the sermons were written while Martin Luther King was in a Georgia prison for holding a prayer vigil during the Albany movement. On September 15, 1963, a bomb went off at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, killing 4 teenage girls. The next day, September 16th, Martin Luther King delivered a 7-minute eulogy honoring the 4 girls. He speaks about the rising hatred caused by racism.
In its January 1964 time named Martin Luther King Jr. Man of the Year for 1963, making the civil rights leader the first African American to receive this honor. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X met only once. On March 26, 1964, the two black leaders were on Capitol Hill attending Stanton depend on the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Why Can't We Wait is a 1964 book by Martin Luther King Jr. about the nonviolent movement against racism in the United States. On June 11, 1964, King was arrested on the steps of the Monson Motel for trespassing when he and others attempted to eat at the restaurant, which had a whites-only policy.
After the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the FBI had more power to help with voting rights. In 1964, Martin Luther King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize of his dynamic leadership of the civil rights movement and steadfast commitment to achieve justice through nonviolent action.
In an event that would become known as Bloody Sunday, voting rights marchers are beaten at the Edmund-Pettus Bridge in Saline, Alabama, as they attempt to march to Montgomery.
On March 25th, 1965, Martin Luther King led thousands of nonviolent demonstrators to the steps of the Capitol in Montgomery, Alabama. After 5 days, 54-mile march of Selma, Alabama, where local African Americans, the student nonviolent coordinating committee and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had been campaigning for voting rights.
All the world today knows that we are here and we are standing before the forces of power in the state of Alabama saying we ain't gonna let nobody turn us around.
King publicly opposes the Vietnam War at a mass rally at the 9th annual convention of SCLC in Birmingham.
King and his wife moved into an apartment at 1550 South Hamilton Avenue in Chicago to draw attention to the city poor housing condition.
In a radio address made during his final evening in India, King reflected, "Since being in India, I am more convinced than ever before that the method of non-violent resistance is the most potent weapon available to oppress people in their struggle for justice and human dignity."
Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence, also referred to it as the River Church speech, is an anti-Vietnam War and pro-social justice speech delivered by Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4th, 1967, exactly 1 year before he was assassinated.
Where do we go from here? Chaos or community is a 1967 book by Martin Luther King Jr. advocating for human rights and a sense of hope. It was King's fourth and last book before his 1968 assassination.
King publicly reveals his plans to organize a mass civil disobedience campaign, the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C., to force the government to end poverty. On 1st of February 1968, two Memphis garbage collectors, Eco Cole and Robert Walker, were crushed to death by a malfunctioning truck. 11 days later, frustrated by the city's response to the latest event in long pattern of neglect and abuse of its black employees, 1,300 black men from the Memphis Department of Public Works went on strike. Sanitation workers led by garbage collector turned union organizer T.O. Jones and supported by the president of the American Federation of State Country and municipal employees, Jerry Worth demanded recognition of the union, better safety standards, and a decent wage.
On March 28, 1968, King returned to Memphis to lead a march with Lawson in support of the strike. The protest turned ugly when an outside group infiltrated the marchers and became violent, leading to the death of an African-American teenager.
Despite the tragedy, the strike continued, as did smaller demonstrations.
At 6:05 p.m. on Thursday, 4th April 1968, Martin Luther King was shot dead while standing on his balcony outside of his second floor room at the Yoden Motel in Memphis, Tennessee.
News of King's assassination promoted major outbreaks of racial violence, resulting in more than 40 deaths nationwide and excessive property damage in over 100 American cities.
James Earl Ray, a 40-year-old escaped fugitive, later confessed to the crime and sentenced to a 99-year prison term.
King's final resting place is here. The King Center and tomb are located across the Auburn Avenue from the National Park Service Visitor Center. Coretta Scott King chose this location for her husband's tomb between his birth home and his spiritual home church.
Thank you, Dr. King. Thank you for marching. Thank you for our leaders. Happy birthday, Thank you for teaching teachers. Thank you for being proud. Happy birthday.
Thank you, Dr. King.
Thank you, Dr. King.
Thank you for your dream.
Thank you for the dream.
Thank you for making a change.
Thank you for making a change.
Happy birthday, Dr. King.
Happy birthday, Dr. King.
When we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.